morning on Media and Society, we ask, what can African media and the continent's citizens do to send out a more positive image of the continent? Well, you are watching Media and Society. A very good morning to you, and thank you so much for joining us. Of course, this is the show where we really bring to you the intersection between what the media does and how it impacts you. And we're always keen to hear your thoughts on the discussions that we're having. So do feel free to give us a call over the next hour. The number is 011-714-0661 or 0662. You can also tweet us using the hashtag SABC Media Society. Let's get into our discussion for this morning. The month of May is recognized as Africa Month. And of course, this is the time when the continent of Africa really commemorates the founding of the Organization of African Unity, what we now call the AU, 60 years ago. But Africa Month also seeks to really increase the appreciation and demand for culture and goods and services that are African, really to stimulate competitive markets from trade among African countries. But for centuries, really, Africa has been seen as a place where it is defined by poverty, by disease, conflict and violence. And that's the way we're seen by the greater part of the world. But how are we starting to really change the perceptions around how Africa is seen by the world, and particularly by young media practitioners? How are they changing the face of Africa to the world? We're going to have a big discussion on this one. We're joined on Zoom by Mr. Milton Nkosi. He's Senior Research Fellow at Africa-Asia Dialogues. We're also joined, and he's also the former Africa and South Asia Bureau Chief at BBC. We're going to be speaking to Thebe Ikalakeng, who is the founder and chairman of Brand Africa. But we're also joined by Benin Oluka, who is the Africa editor for the for Global Investigative Journalism Network. And then we have a young TikTok superstar and comedian, Ofentse Baloyi, a social media entertainer, joining us in studio. Ofentse, good morning.
Good morning, Ali. How are you?
I'm really glad to have you in studio, and we particularly wanted him to be in studio because he is the face of what we're seeing as that young movement that is changing the way that Africa is seen. But Mr. Nkosi, I want to start with you. You have been covering the stories about how Africa is seen for a very long time. When you talk about that trajectory, right, even when you set up the bureau for BBC in Africa, what was the narrative around Africa then, and has it changed at all for you?
Yeah, good morning. It's good to be here. This topic that we're discussing this morning has been on the lips of African broadcasters, intellectuals for many, many years before. And times have changed. We're now living in a digital world. There used to be a time when Africa's communications infrastructure wasn't that strong and that broad and that deep. And therefore, the internationals were running rings around African media. But now that things have changed, we're in the 21st century, 2023, Africans are beginning to tell their own story. So the idea that when I was still running BBC News in Africa, that we are the only ones talking about Africa and we're portraying Africa badly or good, whichever way you want to slice that cake, are over, because Africans are now telling their own story. I want to remind you of the Chinua Achebe, very famous quote that until the lion learns to write, stories of the hunter will always be glorified. And this is where Africa, the lion, is now rising. It's telling its own story. And by its own story, now, I don't mean just in television news, which is the area that I come from, essentially. But the story is across the board. If you look at the American story, for instance, we are not just consuming American television news. We watch Netflix, we watch their movies in Hollywood, and we love their music. And that is still part of the American narrative to the world. So if we get to push Africa's story beyond just how we are covered by the news, whether there's Sudan fighting and it's bad in our own image, then we're not going to win that war. The other thing I wanted to point out is that it's incredibly important to recognize African journalists who are the very first people to tell the stories that embarrass us when we see them on the international channels. For instance, if you see a big story that of corruption, what we've just seen on Al Jazeera in the series of the gold mafia and so on, and the fighting in Sudan and the attacks in northeastern Nigeria, and the homophobic approach in Uganda, and all those stories that make you cringe if you are an African and you are embarrassed about your own image across the world. Remember that the local journalists are the ones who get those stories first. So it's unfair on them because they work hard, risk their lives, get the stories, and then those stories get picked up by the internationals. So it's important to recognize the work done by our own African journalists on the ground.
Yeah, and that's an important one. And that's a great way for me to sew into the next question then. And I'll bring that to you, Benin. You are an investigative journalist. You're the editor of the Global Investigative Journalism Network. And what Mr. Ngosi's talked about there essentially is you're the first one that tells the story. So you, the first one on the ground that finds the story that for the most part embarrasses Africans, right? The story of poverty, of corruption, and the list goes on and on and on. How does that shape your perception of the brand of the continent?
Yes, thank you, Naledi. Now, I think investigative journalism, for starters, also goes both ways. There is investigative journalism that uncovers wrongdoing, and there is investigative journalism that tells the stories, that goes in depth to discover what is being done right, and to tell others that, you know, this is something that, for instance, an institution in Ghana is getting right. Could an institution in South Africa emulate that? Maybe for the most part, we have done investigative reporting that looks at uncovering wrongdoing. And I think that is down to sort of the way our society operates right now. The reality is that there's a lot of there's a lot that's going on wrong within our societies, and unless we bring it out in the open, we have conversations about it, we are not going to overcome those issues. So I think the beginning really is to do with the structural and the structural setup of the continent and the administration of public affairs. We are getting it wrong in the management of our own public affairs, and we should not hide from having those conversations. Now, what the foreign media does is to amplify to the world those kinds of issues that we have. And I think they're not, we can't blame them for amplifying that if internally we're not having those, we're not correcting the mistakes that we're making.
Yeah, I mean, and that's something that we can't deny. Yeah, the introspection is important. And looking at the ugly is important as well. Let's speak to Tebe here, because you've got quite the responsibility here, where you've got to sell the brand that is Africa. Considering everything that Milton Ngozi has talked about, that Benin Oluka has talked about, how do you go about doing your job? I mean, what is the wording that you use, I suppose, at the top of the list when you sell the brand Africa? I think your mic is off, Tebe.
Apologies.
There
Apologies.
You go.
Midlothian Airport, as always, headed towards another African country, from another African country in the next few minutes. I think our story, of course, has changed quite a bit from 1957, when Ghana became the first sub-Saharan African country to gain independence, or even 100 years exactly this year, when Egypt became the first country in the entirety of the continent to gain its independence. And that story, the way it started a story of hopefulness, a story of can-do, a story of African pride. It's changed over the years for many reasons. Changed over the years because unfortunately we've abdicated the responsibility of telling the story of Africa to others rather than championing the story ourselves. I mean, a recent survey by Africa No Filter showed that 63% of the correspondents who cover Africa are not based in Africa. And when they do cover the story of Africa, they cover the story of corruption, of poverty, and of hopelessness. So our job as African Story is, as Milton said in the beginning, we need to re-narrate the story of the continent. And in re-narrating the story of the continent, we need to tell the story of yet another proud continent, a continent that can reverse, can rather build on the gains of 1963 when the Africans got together to form the African Union. And because at that time, it was all about rebuilding the story of the continent. So telling the story of the continent, hopefulness, resilience, and can-do.
Yeah, hopefulness, resilience, and can-do. I'm going to remember those. When you talk about re-narrating the story of Africa, I take it to what the young content creators are doing in South Africa, on the continent. I mean, if you go onto TikTok, for instance, it's one of the biggest social media platforms in the country. What you've got there is the word Amapiano having had over 6 billion hits across the world. That's what young content creators are doing and changing the face of Africa. So let me bring it now to Ofense, and I'm sure the young people that are watching are losing their minds because Ofense, the TikTok superstar, is here. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Talk to me about what it is exactly that happens on TikTok that gives you the space really to reach such a wide audience that you almost started creating new narrative around who we are as South Africans.
Sure. I think one way that I can say TikTok has taken over media and social media specifically is that they've broken a lot of barriers. A lot of barriers have come down in communication. It's basically globalization on the internet. You know, now we're not forced to be watching American TV anymore. We're not forced to be watching conventional TV anymore. Now we're at a place where you can choose almost what you want to hear from who you want to hear, whoever you want to see it from. They don't need to be a certified actor. They don't need to be a certified comedian. Of course, that has its dangers, you know, obviously with false information spreading and fake news and whatnot. But the fact that they've broken down so many barriers geographically, mentally, a lot of people share a lot of insight on TikTok. So TikTok is a very free platform, and it makes space for almost anything, entertainment. It makes space for news. It makes space for the way the Amapiano scene has blown up. Like, all of this is all kind of how flat TikTok is as a landscape, you know. I can release a video about Amapiano now and someone in the Netherlands will be reacting like, you know, it's something that happens every day to them right now. So,
but are you seeing that there is that interest in South African and African content?
Yeah.
And it seems to be growing, particularly on social media, more so than it's doing on mainstream media.
Sure. I mean, like, there's different things that will trend that'll show you that there's an interest. I mean, there was a point where a lot of Nollywood clips were trending. So you'll find a lot of Nollywood movies, get out of here, man, you know what I'm saying? So there was a huge comedic aspect and a huge sense of expression in that sense. And then you come to people like us who act out daily life, you know. And then, I mean, I remember I made a video that trended in Southeast Asia. I don't even know which country exactly, and I had to just keep pressing translate on the comments because they were even confused that we had sync. So I was washing my dishes in the video, and the sink was full. They're like, "Why is your sink blocked?" You know, now they were actually being curious as to why we washed the dishes with a full sink instead of letting the water run through. So small things like that kind of showed me that you can find out anything from anybody on TikTok. And I didn't realize that so many people from so many other countries were watching us, but the Amapiano movement just made it so clear. So
just to go back to the sink analogy, and I want to sit there for a little bit. Essentially, what you're saying to me is that they were surprised that you even have the sort of infrastructure that you do, that you're not sitting there with kwashiorkor and a fly in your eye.
Exactly. You know, like, we change a lot of TikTokers that have blown up, especially right in the last year, have showcased South Africa in such a good light. And not even just South Africa, and Africa as a whole. I feel like that's why we're being chosen for these music videos, you know. You'll find a group of kids that have been dancing get chosen for a music video by a very huge American superstar.
Yes.
Or now people like us can translate our talent into acting and go into conventional media. So we've just shown such a great aspect of South African media in that sense. Like we showcasing our acting, we showcasing our dancing, we showcasing just how we freestyle almost everything at the same level that they do on an American commercial space. You know, like we don't need to worry about trying to come off a certain way. We don't need to worry about hiding certain things and things like that. So I'm loving it. I'm honestly loving it.
I mean, you guys are doing an incredible job, and I told you I'm a complete fan. And if you're on TikTok and you know, I think you need to go out and check Primo Baloyi.
Yes.
While you're watching, go down to TikTok and look up Primo Baloyi. You're going to have the time of your life on there. Mr. Milton Kosi, I want to bring this back to you, right? There seemingly here is a shift that's happening where it's the younger guys that are not on mainstream media that are doing much better at selling the African story than what we're doing here with mainstream media. What do you make of that?
Yeah, sure. I think that is exactly where this should be moving. We're moving the needle in the right direction there. And it shouldn't just be on TikTok, by the way. It should be on YouTube, on Twitter, on Instagram, on WhatsApp, on whatever you can. But most importantly, telling the African story, as I mentioned earlier, is not limited to just visual stories. There's an explosion of writing. Many people, I go to book launches almost every week now, and sometimes you can't even make some of the invites because people are writing their own stories and producing literature that the whole world is yearning for, but more importantly, us as Africans are yearning for, because the stories that we are talking about, you know, we're always worried about our image in the world. But what about our image to ourselves? What are we telling Africans, the African youth, about ourselves? It's important right now to change tact and stop yearning for love from outside and make sure that love comes from within. Charity begins at home. For instance, we have a situation in the last few weeks in the following the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, where South Africa seems to be not sure where it's standing. It can't condemn the invasion, but at the same time, it doesn't want to come out clearly to support Russia because it's taking what they call non-aligned stance. Well, it's important that us as Africans, we must now learn to talk about the African agenda and not wait to be loved by Russia or by America. What is the African agenda? What are we doing for Africa's own internal benefit? So we need to change the narrative, not just in, you know, the 7 o'clock bulletin on television or the 6 o'clock bulletin on radio. The narrative must change in its entirety. Africa needs to grow its confidence, and there's no one who will love you. Believe you me, you know, we've seen bits of this world. The world is not so kind as sometimes it looks on Hollywood television or Netflix. The people who love you are your own people. Start there. Okay, make sure that the stories we are telling, and I said earlier the stories about literature, but stories go beyond literature. It's about food, okay? It's about music. It's about art. What are you consuming? What's hanging on your wall? Are you hanging African pieces on your wall, or do you have, you know, the London Bridge hanging on your wall? So think about where your aspirations are going to. The other thing I wanted to mention is language. We are all now speaking in the English language from a small island on the western corner of the European continent. That country is tinier than our country. It's from a smaller continent than our continent. We have an explosion of languages, from Kiswahili to Yoruba to Zulu, Tswana. You know, all these languages we must explore them. Not everything, not every book has to come out in English. You can write in isiXhosa, you can write your book in Twi, which they speak in Ghana. You can write your book in any African language that you want to express yourself in. And there's a key component in Africa because of our colonial history, sadly. There is this labeling that the people who were colonized or countries that were colonized by the British are Anglophone, and the ones that were colonized by the French speaking world are the Francophone, and the ones by the Portuguese were Lusophone. We need to break those barriers. We are not Francophone. We are not Anglophone. We are Zulu. We are Xhosa. We are Tswana. That's who we are. And until we get to that point internally, forget what the world says about you. I used to live in India, and they have over 200 television channels, and they all came up in the last few years. They were not there 20 years ago. But look at how they are telling their own story within their own country. The stories are in Hindi, in Gujarat, in all the local languages there. And the children grow up knowing their folklore from their own people, and then you can go and share that story with the world. But if you're waiting for BBC and CNN to come and validate you, in isiZulu bathi uzaba mbutalako, you'll wait until you touch the mirage, which is never going to happen.
Yeah, that's a
Because
it really is. Tebe, I was going to come to you. Go ahead. Yes. Go ahead, Tebe.
I was saying that Milton is so right, because and Africans we're always complaining, blaming others for telling the African story in their own way. We forget that Al Jazeera created Al Jazeera to be able to retell the story of the Arab world. BBC created a story to tell the story from a British way, and so is CNN, and so are TV. Our job is to create the channels to be able to tell our story in our way. And the great Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o said, the man who cannot speak in his mother's tongue, but can speak the others very well, is enslaved. But he says the man who can speak his mother tongue even better and is as brilliant with the other language is empowered. So our job is to be able to tell our story, as Milton says, in our way, in our languages. And to remember that telling the story is not only about reporting news, but it's also about creating. And that's why I like the idea about the TikTok. I like the idea you tell about what Baloyi in terms of what is done. And from what I do for a living, which is building great brands around the continent, is one of the ways we can tell the story of Africa is the story of a self-sufficient continent that creates the products and services that serve their people in their own way. Us taking pride in our creativity.
Yeah, there's so much more to talk about. We're not done with this conversation, and also taking your calls on 011-714-0661. How is it that you'd like to see the media change the face of Africa, how the world views Africa? And also, for you, what would that look like? Where are the opportunities, and where are some of those green shoots that you see? Give us a call, 011-714-0661. Welcome back. You're watching Media and Society with myself, Naledi Moleo. As we enter Africa Month, this morning we're discussing how the media depicts Africa. Is it still seen largely as a continent that is riddled with disease, poverty, and corruption? And where are we starting to see media practitioners, whether young or old, on mainstream media or even on social media, really starting to change that picture of the continent? We are in conversation with Mr. Milton Ngosi, Senior Research Fellow at Africa-Asia Dialogues and former Africa and South Asia Bureau Chief at BBC. We're joined by Mr. Tebe Kalafeng, who is the founder and chairman of Brand Africa, Mr. Benin Oluka, who is the Africa editor for the Global Investigative Journalism Network, as well as Ofenze, who is an absolute superstar, Ofenze Baloyi, a social media entertainer, comedian, and content creator. I want to come to you, Benin, for a moment now, because what we've talked about a lot is needing for us to change the way we even tell our stories. Milton and Tebe talked about the language that we use. Are you starting to see that shift? I mean, even as an investigative journalist, where you have to start saying to Africans, this is the ugly that we face as a continent. What language are we doing it in? Are we doing it more and more in a language that relates to Africans and gives them some pride?
Yes, Naledi, we are beginning to see that change. And it's a change for the better. You see lots of stories coming from different parts of Africa that are trying to show the positive side of Africa. I think a lot of media organizations have embraced what is called solutions journalism. And they are trying to, for instance, provide solutions to the problems that Africa is facing, rather than merely point out where the problems are. But I think that we should be doing more than that. The starting point, journalism or communication at the level we're talking about right now is sort of the finished product. But we should be thinking about education about Africa within, for instance, our institutions, our schools, primary schools, at the earliest stage. I mean, how many young people get to know about the good things happening around their continent from the earliest of stages? We learn about the prairies in Canada. We learn about what's happening in the UK. You find young people who know more about the US, thanks to, of course, Hollywood, than what is happening around Africa. We should be beginning with that. And then two, there should be programs that look at helping Africans get to know more about each other. We still have visas to get to travel to around Africa. In coming to South Africa costs me about, I think, over $200 every trip. Going to Nigeria will cost me so much, but we are on the same continent. We are the same people, and yet we are having all these barriers towards travel. We're having barriers to. So how are you going to know about your continent if you don't study about it when you're young? When you get to working stage, or at the stage where you're traveling, you can't travel to some places for holiday, for instance, because of the visa requirements that are so high. You cannot interact. You don't have a Pan-African media organization that helps to shape all this storytelling, because there might be a different story being told on TikTok. There is another story being told by Nollywood. There is another one being told by, different content creators. But who then brings together all these different content producers to then have one message that goes out there? And then who is moderating this conversation in other languages, African languages, beyond perhaps the one that the content producers are using? So all these are challenges we should be looking at in a more comprehensive way. Let's not just look at journalism and communication as a single thing. We should be looking at all the other factors that could facilitate people to get to know about the continent and then communicate, the best of it to ourselves, first of all, and then to the world.
Yeah. I want to bring it back to studio. You want to come in there, Offense?
So I just want to kind of talk about especially the factor of language in the way we express ourselves in our story. I've seen very interesting things happening on TikTok. I like referencing my content as the benchmark, because I've never gotten so much of a response, from anything else, and I've never seen so much of a wide response on social media. So I have a lot of fans from all over the continent, which is the funniest thing to me, because a lot of my content is either in Zulu, it's in English, it's trending in Sepedi or Sesotho, a South African language. And I'll get people commenting from Nigeria telling me, oh, dude, we love your content. People from Namibia, people from Zambia. So as much as language does kind of feel like a big barrier in between everybody and how we communicate and express ourselves, I think there is also a huge opening of the communication lines, because even now, so as an example, when the shutdown was happening and the lady trended for saying 4:10,
yes,
in Driawa, all of that stuff kind of is in Zulu, and all of a sudden this video, my video got 1.9 million views, and this is not just from our country, this is all over the continent. So I think there definitely is a space to widen the conversation without the actual emphasis on the language.
Okay.
I think there is a standard that we need to reach. So the investigative journalist that
Mr.
I was just
Bernard,
speaking,
yes.
Mr. Bernard. So he was saying things like we need to moderate the language and we need to bring things together. I think the better way to think about it is to moderate the standard. So I think there's a way in which we should be communicating, and I think then once we reach that standard, it will be much easier to communicate any message. You don't need to actually tweak the language so that the other person can understand. I mean, that's why visual entertainment actually helps, because it's so layered. I can layer the sound with the actions and the joke and everything else so that the whole message comes across, not just this part, not just the education or not just, you know what I'm saying?
And that's an interesting point. And I want to bring you, apologies. Tebe, I want to bring you in here. I know you need to rush off as well and get on a flight. But I think that even what we've heard from Ofense Tebe is actually giving you, I suppose, quite a list of things to get right here and how we bring the stories together of what Africa does to tell its own story. Talk to me about how we then raise the standard. That's what Ofense is talking about, how we raise the content. And it's not just about the language and some targets that you've set for yourself. Your sound is off again, Tebe.
A part of it, if you look at the Agenda 2063 of the African Union, it is about an integrated, a peaceful, and a prosperous continent. So part of how we raise the narrative of the continent, how we retell that story, as everyone is alluding to, is about asking ourselves how we as Africans, not just this Africa Month, but every day, how we are working together, how we are collaborating as Africans to be able to tell a singular story of a continent that is not just rising, but a continent that is proud and confident. So how we collectively begin to tell that story, how we tell it not just through our celebration every Africa Day, but celebrations every day. How we get rid of stories about xenophobia or actions about xenophobia. How we even, for example, now when you look at the challenges about where does Africa stand in relation to warfare and all those around the world, how we as Africans begin to say, fight our own battles for ourselves and says, this is we, Africa, this is where we stand here, and not take, for example, not aligned our postures everywhere else. To me, part of telling the African story is a singular story of a continent that is proud, that is integrated, and ultimately that will be prosperous. And that prosperity is a prosperity that has to be shared with everybody. Because the problem with our continent is we're a continent of strong men and not a continent of strong ideas. We need to be a continent of strong ideas and ideas that contribute towards a greater African story.
Yeah, that's a lot to think about. We're going to let you go, Mr. Igel. I think thank you so much for your time. I know that you need to get on a flight, but we'll continue with our conversation in a moment as we take a short break. And of course, taking your calls, 0117140661. Where are you starting to see media practitioners, whether young or old, on social media or mainstream media, changing the face of Africa? Give us a call, 0117140661. Welcome back. You're still watching Media and Society as we discuss Africa Month and how the media contributes to the way that Africa sees itself, but also how the world sees Africa, from African artists, musicians, and writers. They have really made significant contributions to the way that Africa is viewed by the world. We continue that conversation with Mr. Milton Ngosi, who is a Senior Research Fellow at Africa-Asia Dialogues and former African South Asia Bureau Chief at BBC. We're also joined by Mr. Benon Oluka, who is the Africa editor for the Global Investigative Journalism Network, and Ufanza Baloyi, a social media entertainer. I want to bring it back to you. Let's talk about some of the content creators that you see from other parts of the continent that really stand out for you, that you know, not only should we go and follow them, but are changing the way people are seeing Africa.
So the nice thing about a lot of African content creators, so here in South Africa, there's a very big, I don't want to say hierarchy, but there's a very big separation in terms of talents. So you'll see a lot of the same faces popping up. On the African continent, it gets a little bit more different. You start seeing the same countries, not the same faces popping up. So I don't have specific content creators that I follow from other countries. So you will follow them, but they don't stand out specifically until you start seeing people that start touching on the same messages that they have in their country. Until you start seeing people from Nigeria touching on their Sunday life, you know, like how they act in church and how church is. Like, there's a lot of Nigerian content creators that are changing just the normal songs into gospel. They make them sound the way they hear gospel music, which is for me the most fascinating thing, because we have the exact same content creator who's doing something similar here in Alfie Sipo, who can turn almost any trending big club song into a very gospel sounding song. So I like the fact that a lot of us Africans right now, you see a big similarity in how we are expressing our daily life. You see a big similarity in our memories, in how we grew up. And I feel like the more we increase the pride and confidence to really express what that one little thing that you went through, you know, just waiting in line for your mom to come back with the groceries, and the line starts moving forward and you start to panic because you can't see your mom anywhere. Small things like that, you realize that we actually all just had the same childhood. We all just, you know, we were raised by a similar set of people. And a lot of the time that'll always end up in a similar set of expression, thoughts, in a similar, so I think that growth in confidence is now starting to show in the way we all start to create throughout the continent. Now you start seeing similarities in our styles.
Yeah, I quite like that. And I've seen videos where you've seen, you know, young black children, African, you can see that they're in a, you know, poverty-stricken village in the middle of Malawi somewhere, but they've choreographed these dance moves and the video goes viral globally.
Huge. I mean, there's even this big trend going on with the kids in Tanzania that jump off the bridge. That was huge. A lot of celebrities from America had to just come there just to be able to experience that, just to be able to also be a part of that. There's huge migrations. There's the kids who recreate big movie scenes with almost nothing. So they're running in their own little villages in the dust and hiding behind the walls and recreating the most iconic movie scenes in the most simplest, basic, naturalistic ways. So I think it's amazing in the way that we can all kind of just get stuck into our experience and just communicate it freely. Just tell the next person.
I want to bring you in, Mr. Milton Gossi, because I think if you're a Pan-Africanist, you would know that, oh, what a wonderful time for Africa. It's, you know, the Africa Free Trade Area Agreement. It's a big discussion as well. But how do we start to really bring even that discussion of African unity forward, right, in a fun way, like these young people are doing on social media, where even just the very idea of even trading between each other, we're just building each other actively as a continent becomes something that we actually look forward to doing.
Yeah, that's very important. And I just want to commend Baloyi for the work that he's doing and many other of his colleagues, because nobody is commissioning them. They're doing this of their own volition. So it's something to be embraced, considering the fact that over 60% of Africa's population is young people under the age of 35. And we as African leaders are not taking the youth seriously. And yet they are the majority on the continent. So for instance, if you look at the South African situation, we are in a very weird situation here where the Minister of Youth is like over 70 years old. I mean, you can slice that cake the way you want it, I say again. But it does not add up. If you're taking young people seriously, you'll have someone a little bit younger that they can relate to, working with them to try and advance their own agenda. Remember, there is an African saying that says it takes a village to raise a child. The adverse of that is that if the village rejects its own child, the child will burn it down to feel its warmth. Okay, it's a very important concept. These are African concepts, by the way, that we need to think about and embrace and take seriously. And that, of course, will segue us into the African Free Trade Agreement area, where Africans need to start trading with each other to advance each other's economies and agendas. Take, for instance, colonial railways were running across the African continent. So if you see the African continent, the railways in Africa are lined up across horizontally, because they were taking the minerals out of Africa onto the ports and off to sea to other continents. And our job now, instead of looking for love and admiration from outside, we need to realign our railway lines and our roads to look more north-south, so that we can trade within the continent. And that is what is going to expand the economy. That's what is going to, as Tebe said quite rightly, is going to give us not just a rising continent, but a confident continent within itself. And we're always taught, particularly on GPV areas, that boys need to increase their own self-confidence and their own self-worth, so that they don't have to have this inferiority complex which leads them to be violent on women. The same applies to the continent. We need to have our own self-worth increased and our own confidence, so that we don't have to go looking for love from Europe, Asia, and so on. And like now, we're dancing. We don't know which way we're facing. We want to be friends with the Russians. We still like McDonald's and Google and YouTube from the Americans. Who are we? What are we interested in? What is our agenda to advance our own prosperity? And that is the critical factor to consider here as we move beyond waiting for CNN and BBC to come and tell a good story about yourself.
Yeah, that's a good point. Dependent, I want to bring you in here, because I think in us being able to tell that story, one would hope that you'd also have journalists that, are able to reach across borders and collaborate and tell that story in unison, even if it is the stories around the corruption. So let's talk about whether or not we're seeing enough of that. Collaborative efforts between journalists across the continent.
Yes, thank you, Naledi. Now, I think there's been a huge increase in collaboration between journalists on the continent. There are lots of there's collaboration between public broadcasters. I've seen quite a bit of it. There's even more collaboration between journalists
Benin?
who have set up non-profit media organizations. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead. You just cut off for a moment there, but you can continue.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so there are even more collaborations between journalists who are setting up non-profit organizations. I am happy that the African Union now has a media fellowship that takes journalists from different parts of the continent and takes them across the continent to just learn how things are being done in other places. But having said that, I think there is still more that needs to be done. And sometimes some of this more that needs to be done may not have to be done in those structured environments. It can be done by content creators. It can be done by people working individually. And then eventually, as their content gains a following on the continent, then they can, of course, get to work with others. There is a Ghanaian Wademaya. There's a Ghanaian YouTuber called Wademaya, who has been traveling around the continent, just sharing exciting stories about Africa. You should look him up. He's doing really impressive work.
Yeah.
To share the positive side of Africa. Now, what I learned from content producers like Kodemaya is just to share authentic Africa as it is. I think for a long time we have not been confident enough to share Africa to the world as it is, rather than how we have been socialized to behave. We glorify Hollywood, we glorify Europe, and a lot of people tended to sort of communicate in the way they did. But what we're seeing now is people communicating the African story in the authentic way. And I think that authenticity is what is winning over not just fellow Africans, but winning over outsiders as well.
Yeah.
The young Ugandans who do they're called the ghetto kids, who do, for instance, dance videos.
Yes.
Have become a sensation around the world because they don't have to, you know, they do it in their own way in the environment that they live in, you know, dusty streets, and they dress up the way they wish, but they use dance to tell the African story, and that has helped them warm their way into people's hearts around the world. Content creators in Kenya, in Nigeria, have, you know, people who are sharing about the food they eat, people who are sharing about the tourism areas people should visit, are all doing it within their environments without having to, you know, make anything better than it looks. And the world is sort of, the way globalization has made the world look so much similar that you could go to Germany and you go to Johannesburg and it's the same. But it's now the people living in the rural areas, for instance, who have the more original, authentic lifestyles that everyone else is looking to see something different. So that is something we should be looking at and projecting to the world and to ourselves.
It's the ghetto kids. That's who I'm a fan of.
So I very, very much like what Mr. Burns said about how we need to collaborate more and how authenticity is winning over a lot of people, because I realize now that that's actually the crux of trending information, entertainment, whatever it may be, is the sense of authenticity that always remains. So, which also brings me back to the topic that we spoke about earlier, about how TikTok is kind of breaking down barriers and, you know, just flattening the landscape. I think we just need a lot more platforms that showcase African authenticity, that praise it too, not just ones that allow it to just live there. You know, like on TikTok, you see a lot of attention gravitating to people who can make the most out of the least. You know, that's why the kids in Uganda can dance in the streets barefoot and then end up performing on a stage in Las Vegas, you know, having a residency. So I definitely think there needs to be more emphasis in the platforms that allow us to be authentic, the platforms that praise doing so much with very little, because I feel like that's what we do as Africans.
Where's the business, though? Where's the business element of it? Because we can very well say that, well, you know, changing the face of Africa is something that we do with authenticity. Yes. But the face and brand USA is built as a business. It's taken very seriously. So where's the support for you?
So personally, a lot of my support comes from big business brands all over the country, internationally known business brands. And I feel like that's the connection that literally comes up when we show who we are. People now want to be involved with who we are. So I've worked with the biggest brands in the world. I've worked with Samsung, I've worked with McDonald's, I've worked with almost all the food retailers, I've worked with everybody. So, and this is a person who has almost nothing. I use my phone and a tripod and I communicate my memories. So I feel like that space, if I can monetize that's my space of expression with almost absolutely nothing, just the sheer attention that it brings, I can make 1 million views in 15 hours.
Goodness.
So, and I feel like that's the point of monetization. The fact that so much attention comes from doing so much, being so great, being so authentic, being so excellent. With the bare minimum, I think there's a huge market to kind of just sell that authenticity, because that's all we are. We, as a country, as a people, we are so used to taking the crumbs that we have left and making more bread.
Listen, I feel like I'm in the wrong business. That's how I feel right now, honestly. But we're going to wrap it up. Milton Nkosi, I'm going to bring it to you now, just as we close off, right? To the journalist, to the storyteller, the musician, the content creator, a few things that you want them to be thinking about when they consider the fact that they are brand ambassadors for the continent.
I think, thank you very much. I think that you have to consider also some simple facts. you know, in the channels that we feel are portraying Africa negatively, there are many Africans who are working there across CNN, Al Jazeera, BBC, and so many others, including RT, I think, Russia Today. So, and many other European channels and Turkish channels and so on. There are many Africans who work there who know the African story and can tell it perhaps better than some of their colleagues who are based in Europe and America. But the one thing I wanted to add as we close is that we need to think beyond dance groups, okay? It's good that people are creating content of dancing. There's nothing wrong. The arts is a very important part of life and culture. So we must, you know, Ndlovu Choir as well has done very well in America and so on. Who are just brilliant performers. But we need to think even beyond TikTok. TikTok is the latest craze, okay? We had the latest craze many years ago with some of these things. I remember a time when there was something called Mix It. I mean, I don't know if some people know what Mix It is.
I remember that, yes.
These things come and go, technology advances. We need to think beyond that. For instance, we are now entering the era of artificial intelligence, AI. What are we doing for Africa's benefit? And how do we want AI to advance Africa's agenda? I think that is critically important, and especially on knowledge production, academically. So we must spread the wings about telling Africa's story beyond the here and now and the headlines of today. I think that is what will help our story to be shared across the world, even amongst ourselves, in the most positive light. So not just about news, it's literature, it's music, it's food, it's culture, it's young people, it's everybody in the mix. As long as you are telling the African story in its broadest form, then you will be advancing the African agenda.
Yeah, well, I think that's a perfect place for us to leave it, because it's a call to action for all of us. And thank you so much to all of our guests who have continued to make a massive contribution to changing the face of the way that the world views Africa. Mr. Benin Oluka, Milton Nkosi, thanks as well to our guest earlier, Tebe Ikalafeng, as well as Ofense Baloyi. An absolute pleasure having you in studio. We're back again next week, Sunday, right here on SABC News. Have yourselves a wonderful day.